Welcome to the third part of ISA's three-part video series on the Kisan protests in India. The Kisan protests began across North India late last year in response to three farm bills that were passed by the Indian government in the September of 2020. Since then, farmer unions and various representatives have demanded that the laws be repealed. The protests have expanded across the globe in various South Asian communities. ISA Human believes that it is important to understand the situation through an educational lens and support the communities that are affected.
Our third speaker in this three-part series is Mr. Devinder Sharma. Mr. Sharma is a distinguished food and trade policy analyst. Trained as an agriculture scientist, Mr. Sharma researches policy issues concerning sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, food security and poverty, biotechnology and hunger, and the implications of the free trade paradigm for developing countries. He is the author of various articles and books, including GATT and India, The Politics of Agriculture.
He has been recently rewarded the honorary degree of Professor at Large by the CSK Himachal Pradesh Agricultural University in Palampur, India, and has formerly been a visiting fellow to the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, and has received many other awards. Today, Mr. Sharma will be speaking on global concerns surrounding agricultural economics and how the Indian farmers' protest highlights the issues at large. Please welcome Mr. Devinder Sharma.
Well, I think we need to understand that the Kisan protest or the farmers' protest that we see in India is essentially because of the kind of inequalities that they have witnessed over the last few decades. And when I speak of inequalities, I'm talking of the economic injustice done to farmers over the past few decades. There are several ways to understand how severe has been the agrarian distress and what are the reasons behind it. But I think just to give you an idea, I recall a study which was published by UNTAD way back, and it looked into the farm gate prices across the globe in a 20-year period, somehow spanning between mid-1980s to mid-2000. And the study had said that farmers across the world, the output price had remained almost static or frozen if you adjust for inflation. Now, which means for 20 years, the farm prices had remained frozen. In other words, we can imagine how the farmers would have survived in that 20-year period. The rich countries, of course, provided farmers with subsidies, including direct income support, but developing countries' farmers didn't have that kind of an option. And then comes another study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, along with a New Delhi think tank called ICRIER. And that study shows that between 2000 and 2016-17, a period of 16 years, Indian farmers lost 45 lakh crore rupees. 45 lakh crore rupees would mean that every year the farmers were incurring a loss of 2.64 lakh crore rupees. Now, this is, of course, a huge loss that the farmers had incurred, but at no stage did we hear in the policy debate or in the general perception within the country that anyone was worried about what was happening to Indian agriculture or what was happening to Indian farmers in this period. After all, if the farmers had suffered this kind of a massive loss over a period of 16 years, it clearly showed that the economic injustice that they were faced with was something that the government should have woken up and should have ensured that you bring in a kind of a semblance of equality, if nothing else, and try to see that the farmers are pulled out of that indebtedness or that kind of a trap that farmers were in. I personally feel that the study was an underestimate because it had only studied a handful of crops and then worked out the losses that the farmers had suffered. I'm sure if it would have gone beyond and looked at the entire spectrum of agriculture, the loss that the farmers were incurring would have been monumental. But nevertheless, the point I want to make is that nowhere in our public space did we even bother to acknowledge that there was a huge crisis or an extraordinary crisis that hit Indian agriculture. And then comes another study which was published by Economic Survey 2016. Economic Survey, as you know, is a government's own document produced by the economic wing year after year, and released a few days before the annual budget is presented. And in that Economic Survey 2016, it was mentioned that the average income of a farming family in India in 17 states, which means roughly half the country, was only rupees 20,000 a year. Now, 20,000 a year would mean less than 1,700 rupees a month. If farmers were surviving or the farming families were living with an income package of less than 1,700 rupees a month, which may be something that the youngsters in the cities would be paying a higher mobile bill every month, if you compare the farm income in half the country. And, even if I have to rear a cow, I can't rear a cow at 1,700 rupees a month. And I shudder to think how these families were surviving in that meager income that they had with them. And this is after, 50, 60 years of green revolution. Now, that clearly tells us that Indian agriculture was passing through a terrible, terrible agrarian distress. And somehow the policymakers as well as the academia had turned a blind eye to what was happening in the rural areas. And as a result of which, the anger which was simmering at one stage had built up over the decades. And that's what I call as a compound anger, which farmers now found a kind of a vent through which the anger is spilling out onto the streets. These three central laws come as a vent or as an opportunity for farmers to stand up and express their anger, to say that enough is enough and we cannot tolerate any further exploitation. Well, I think, as we all know, when the Green Revolution came in India, the objective was to increase food productivity and food production, because at that particular time, India was living in what is called as in ship-to-mouth existence. Food will come from the ship direct into the hungry mouths. And India was also at that time, a beneficiary of a public policy called PL 480, under which America and Canada would supply food supplies to India. Now, that was a situation when people were living in hunger. And so it was desperately looking for a revolution or a transformation where it could, become food self-sufficient. And the Green Revolution is part of the history now, and we know that India became a quote-unquote food self-sufficient after Green Revolution came in. And one reason that we all understand is the introduction of high-yielding varieties, along with the package of practices that follows normally, which means the application of chemical fertilizer, irrigation, and so on. But essentially, I think what is forgotten is that there were actually two planks of economic strategy that helped to sustain that Green Revolution thrust. And that was essentially because the government of India brought in a policy to set up or to introduce or to provide farmers with the minimum support price, which was worked out by the policymakers. And that minimum support price for especially the two crops, the two staple foods, wheat and rice, actually envisages that if the markets, because the prices crash at a time when the harvest is surplus. And so at that time, markets cannot be providing an incentive to farmers to continue with the same kind of cultivation or the same kind of cropping pattern. So, MSP was introduced, minimum support price was introduced, that if there are no buyers above that price, the government will step in through the Food Corporation of India in the regulated mandis called the APMC mandis in India. And then the government will mop up that surplus and use the Food Corporation of India or use those channels to distribute the surplus food to the deficit areas in the countries, because the Green Revolution was confined to the northwestern parts of the country at that time, primarily the province of Punjab, which became the food bowl of India, and later it got bifurcated into Punjab and Haryana. But the point I'm trying to make is that that strategy worked very well, and I'm sure that the two planks of what some people call as a famine avoidance strategy have helped India remarkably well to not only become food self-sufficient, but also to sustain that kind of food production over the last few decades. So I think there are important lessons to be learned from the way Green Revolution really was built up, not only based on technology, but also on the kind of public policy support to ensure that it remains sustainable, and it can be sustained over the years. The other consequences of what is called a second generation environmental impacts, depleting groundwater, contamination of food chain, excessive use of fertilizers and chemicals, of course, became prevalent as the Green Revolution progressed. But subsequently, we have reached a stage now that we are looking or trying to take a relook at what the Green Revolution left behind, the scars of Green Revolution, and there is a need to definitely, ensure that we move to a sustainable farming systems, and at the same time ensure that the farm incomes go up, because when the productivity was going up across the globe, it was not correspondingly, backed up by a higher income for the farmers. This happened across the world, and it happened in India. While the emphasis was on raising productivity, perhaps the most important aspect should have been the welfare of farmers, or the accompanying welfare of farmers, which was completely missed out. And the result is that we see anger in the farming community, not only in India, but across the globe. Well, I think that's quite clear and quite evident before us that the central laws or the three central laws that were introduced in June, by bringing in an ordinance, were pushed in a great hurry, and at a time when the COVID pandemic was prevalent, and then subsequently the way the laws were pushed in Parliament, the undue haste that the government showed clearly, were questioned, and there were questions all around, and protests, of course, had begun soon after the ordinance ordinance came out. Protests began in Punjab and Haryana, the northwestern states, because that is where the farmers feared that the minimum support price they have been getting for the last few decades after Green Revolution will gradually go away, and also at the same time, the APMC, the Agriculture Produce Market Committee, mandis we call it in India, or the markets, will also disappear because of the kind of provisions within the law, central laws, which ensures that there are two kinds of markets. Actually, the APMC markets would stay, which means if the government is or the public sector is ensuring that, or the APMC is ensuring that any trade which buys, food from the agriculture commodities in the market, in the APMC mandis, will have to pay tax. Whereas outside the APMC mandis, there was no tax, and anyone was free to come and make the purchases from the farmer. So, which means there will be two systems, and gradually the APMCs would disappear or will become redundant. A fact that is becoming clear now, because in Madhya Pradesh, in central India, which is also a predominantly wheat growing state, we see at least 49 mandis closing down, and the turnover of at least 150 other mandis has crashed, and which clearly shows that the mandis are gradually becoming redundant. And that was the fear expressed by farmers. The government remains steadfast, and government maintains that this is going to benefit the farmers. The farmers will get a higher income because there will be capital inflow into agriculture, and which would mean more of private markets coming up and more of private investment, and then there will be price discovery. Now, that is the government stand, and government did go into after the farmers' protest moved to New Delhi in November last year, the government did have a dialogue with the farmers. I think there have been 12 rounds of the dialogue with farmers, the agitating farmers, and subsequently, I think there is a stalemate after January. And the government is saying that we can go for amendments, but we are not going to repeal the laws. And whereas the farmers are demanding that the laws need to be repealed, so I think there is a quite a clear cut the line drawn, and we now see that after some happenings on the January 26th, the Republic Day of India. The farm movement has now spread to other states, where the farmer leaders are going across the country now, starting with Bengal or Madhya Pradesh, and trying to hold Mahapanchayats, which means larger congregations of farmers, trying to explain to them what is at stake and why they should all be concerned about the dangers or the threats from the central laws. And the farmers' reasoning is that these laws will make farmers subservient to the corporates, and the corporates will eventually take away their land and their resources, and which means farmers would be subject to further exploitation. And given that there are not many jobs available in the urban centers, we all know. So the farmers' angle is that we need to revitalize agriculture, in fact, to make it profitable and economical, and which, of course, means that it is high time to provide farmers with an assured income by way of an assured price. That's what the farmers' central demand is, which means they want the minimum support price to be made a legal right for farmers. So between the government and the farming or the protesting farmers, the line is clearly drawn. Or also, I would say that the way the farmers have been camping at the borders of New Delhi is a historic movement. Historic movement from various angles and aspects that one can look at it, but also it is not easy to sustain a movement or a protest for several months at a stretch, because as we all know, the supply lines get disconnected often when the farmers are protesting. But in this particular case, the society, the support from the society has been remarkable and I would say phenomenal, and which has kept the movement in that kind of a high spirit that we see. Having said that, I think the farmers' protest has a meaning or a implication, and not only for the farmers across the country. This is basically a protest, as people have been pointing out, from several states in the northwestern region of India, but is gradually now spreading to the other states. But essentially, these protests or these farmers who are protesting actually are fighting or not only saving or safeguarding their own, economic interest, but I think are laying the foundation for what could be a model for the rest of the country to follow. But on the other hand, I have always been saying that these protests in India have global implications, and these have a tremendous relevance for farming communities everywhere in the world. And so there is an opportunity for, a requirement, or I would say a need for the farming communities across the globe to keep a close eye on what is happening in India. And I think that is happening. Well, I think this all flows from the assumption that, if we have to achieve a higher growth, we need to, move population out of agriculture into the urban areas. We need to, sacrifice agriculture for the sake of the industry. That's a kind of a economic, design that has been built. This is what happened in America in the last 100 years or so. They pushed people out of agriculture, and pushing is something that, no government would like to do it forcibly. But I think the best way is to make agriculture economically unviable, so that, farmers are forced to abandon their agriculture or their farming practices and move on to become industrial workers or move into the cities. Now, this is a kind of a design that America followed. This is a design which Europe followed. And despite the massive subsidies that Europe continues to provide, even now it provides $100 billion of subsidy every year. And you'll be surprised that 57% of the farm income, average farm income in Europe actually comes from the subsidy support. Now, in America, 40% of the farm income today that the farmers have is actually coming from subsidy support, which means that the markets were not an efficient players when it came to providing farmers with a higher income. It is very clear. And so the same economic design is something that has been pushed on, and we somehow, when we are into learning our economics through economics 101 and economics 201, I think it looks or we have been made to believe that markets are inevitable. We have no choice. We have to rely on markets at the supply demand phenomena to ensure that the farmers can get a higher price. And then of course it is illustrated by what happened in America, what happened in Europe, and so on. But the reality is that markets fail to provide farmers with a higher income in the rich developed countries. It is the subsidy support which ensures what is called as market efficiency. And not only market efficiency, if you look at what is called as market competitiveness, also comes from the kind of subsidy support that is provided to markets in those countries. See, these younger students are the future that the world is looking up to. And I think the future would, as of course all of us know, is in the hands of these younger students, bright students, brilliant students, I would say, very innovative, very entrepreneurship that they carry. All these things are very important, but I think more important is also the economic thinking and the economic rationale that has been built into us or the younger generation, especially now, at a time when the negative consequences of an economic design that the world has followed is becoming all clear before us now. The way, ice caps are reducing, the way, glaciers are receding, the way Antarctica or Arctic is receding in size, and the global melting that is taking place, and also the as I said earlier, the tipping point that the world is now faced with, I think should make the younger generation stand up and ask the right kind of questions. And I think that is very important because if you don't ask the right kind of questions, we will continue with the same kind of flawed economic thinking, or which outdated economic thinking, I would call it, which has done enough damage to the world. I think the kind of inequality that we witness when a handful of people have more economic wealth than a majority of the population, which is brought out every year by brilliant studies, by excellent studies by Oxfam, clearly tells us that that particular economic design has failed to unleash what is called as the animal spirit. It may be animal spirit for the top 1%, but I think for the remaining population, it is important if the younger generations, younger people are able to envisage or are able to look up or draw up a vision which ensures not only equality and justice, but also ensures that the planet is not further devastated, because we have only one planet. So what I'm suggesting is that these younger people need to stand up and ask the right kind of questions. You cannot be just accepting what is given to you as the ultimate answer. I think that ability to stand up and ask a question is very important, and it depends upon your ability to digest and your ability to also be receptive to all kinds of ideas and thought processing. But more important would be, I expect the younger people to move out of their classes or the classrooms, move out of there or start looking outside the computer terminals or their iPads or smartphones. You are much smarter than the smartphones. And please try to use or build up on that smartness as to how to build up a super smart society where everyone gets the benefit of that kind of economic growth that we should now be looking up to. So we need growth, but we don't need the same kind of economic growth that has brought the world to that particular level of brinking or particular level of tripping, as I said earlier. So here is an opportunity, and I think the younger generation, I'm very hopeful, would be able to stand up and make that historic correction, which we in or our previous generations have not succeeded to do. I think here is a challenge, here is an opportunity, and as I said, the world is yours.